Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 version of the installation of our Stuart Katz professor. I was thinking about, when I thought about what I might say to you today, I was thinking back to the early 2000s when I had the opportunity to dispose of a little bit of unrestricted money. And that was the origin of some fellowship programs that we set up for students. And the reason that we directed the money in that way, apart from the fact that, as you all know, most City College students have substantial need, is that we literally, I thought, had no idea how smart our students could be. Because at the time, what we were saying is an average City College student worked an average of 30 hours a week. I thought if I had to work 30 hours a week when I was an undergraduate, it would have been impossible to focus on my work. And I say that today because we think so much about our students and what we can do to make our students successful, that it's not always the case that we apply that same kind of lens to our faculty. And I will tell you, we have extraordinary talent in our faculty. But as my father used to say, writers have to write. And the responsibilities of a university professor, the teaching, the advising, the administrative work, and I will say this year's honoree has done all of that and more, means that we squeeze our writing into the moments after a long day of work, or into weekends, or during summer breaks, or holiday breaks. And what Mr. Katz has done in naming and funding this professorship is allowed us to do, in relationship to our faculty in the humanities, what I thought scholarships and fellowships would do for our students. Would take the extraordinary potential and talent and vision of the people that populate this campus and allow them the resources and the space, and probably more precious than anything else, the time to do what writers do and write. And so year in and year out, not just writers, we've had filmmakers, we've had essayists, we've had poets, but we reveal the potential of the extraordinarily talented people who come to this campus every day to teach our extraordinarily talented students. And so, Mr. Katz, I want to thank you on behalf of the college, not just, obviously, for the resources that you've put behind this professorship, but for the vision with which you looked at this campus and said, what would it look like in terms of the development of our faculty to give one great, talented honoree every year the opportunity to do what they came into their discipline to do, to make a film, to write a poem, to write an essay, to write a book. And I will say that year in and year out, the people who you have supported have taken the momentum of their careers that they had coming into this professorship and used the resources and the time that you have allowed them through your generosity to do something extraordinary. And I will say, although it is not my prerogative today to introduce either you or our honoree this year, I will say that you have made, or we have made in your name, another extraordinary choice. And I can't wait to see what Professor Dekel does with her time as the Stuart K. Katz professor. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming to this year's installation. Thank you again for your vision and your generosity. It is now my pleasure and duty to introduce our provost, Tony Liss, who will make subsequent introductions. Tony?
Thank you, Vince. It's also not my prerogative to introduce our honoree. I'm here to introduce Mr. Katz, who we are all incredibly grateful for making this day and this event possible. But before I do that, it's really a pleasure for me to get to do this particular one. I did not swipe this book from the back table. I bought this book last summer and I read it and I couldn't put it down. And one of the real pleasures of my position is getting to know and learn about the faculty at this college, this amazing place. And, reading this book, and I had been exchanging email with Mikhal about something else, about business, while I was in the middle of reading the book. And so we had a little conversation about the contents of the book. If you haven't read it, pick up your copy at the back. It's really, it's just an amazing story that I think many of us don't know about a group of refugee Jews in Poland during the war who ended up going east through Russia and eventually into Tehran, which is not a path that I think most of us realized happened. And it's an incredible book, and it's both a kind of personal story, so you feel like you get to know Mikhal a little bit, because some of it is a personal family story and some of it is this amazing history. And so I am thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled that Mikhal is this year's honoree, and I couldn't think of somebody better to hold this position this year. So with that, I would like to introduce Mr. Stuart Katz. We are so grateful for this opportunity and for this professorship. Stuart Katz graduated in 1964, Phi Beta Kappa, from City College with a Bachelor of Science in Political Science, and he went on to earn a JD from the NYU Law School in 1968, where he was editor of the Law Review and a member of the Order of the Coif. I had to go to online to see if that was going to be coif or coif, and I found both, so I guessed. He is a preeminent corporate and securities lawyer with a principal focus on mergers and acquisitions. His law practice has covered a wide range of corporate and securities transactions with a principal focus on mergers and acquisitions. He's worked extensively with major public and private companies on a variety of deals, including friendly mergers, hostile tender offers, proxy contests, leveraged buyouts, acquisitions, dispositions, and all sorts of stuff like that. So not a man to mess around with. In addition to the generous gift which established the Stuart Katz Professorship in the Humanities and the Arts at City College, Mr. Katz has funded the Stuart Katz Scholarship at the NYU Law School, a scholarship that gives preference to CCNY students and students from the Bronx. So please join me in both thanking and welcoming Mr. Stuart Katz.
President Boudreau. Oh, I have my mask on. Sorry. President Boudreau, Provost Liss, Dean Miller, freshly minted Katz Professor Mikhal Dekel, and sturdy sons of CCNY, my brother, Gerald Harris, and my cousin, Philip Koltoff, via webcast. Philip is also a Townsend Harris medalist. Professor Dekel, I truly enjoyed reading Tehran Children, which you so kindly sent me. It is the story of your people, my people too, and it so deserves your masterful telling. I'd like, if I may, to give a little background to this professorship. I grew up in the South Bronx on Crotona Park East. My father was a New York City train conductor for over 50 years, and my mother was a school secretary. The only college my family was familiar with was City College. An uncle, an aunt, a brother, and some cousins preceded me here, or at least at a sister school. When I first looked upon the imposing Gothic architecture on City's North Campus, I knew I had arrived at a special place. I also so clearly recall my semi-annual experiences of working out that term's program of classes in this very great hall. And indeed, it is a great hall. Each department had its assigned place with large blackboards advertising which classes were still open. Of course, the younger classes went last, and you might, as a freshman or even a sophomore, hopelessly watch your well-planned schedule of classes collapse with the swipe of an eraser. Notwithstanding Great Hall's registration madness, I truly cherish the first-class education I received at City. With this scholarship, I am trying to pay back, and I am not alone. When I first heard that Professor Dekel was to receive this award, I noticed that, among many other things, she is the director of the Rifkind Center for the Humanities and the Arts at CCNY. So a little Simon Rifkind story. After graduating City, I attended NYU's law school's night classes. Instead of 3, it took 4 years plus a couple of summers. Since I had a family, I worked full-time as a clerk at the law firm Greenbaum, Wolfe and Ernst. They represented the publisher of William Manchester's book, Death of a President, which covers 5 days surrounding President Kennedy's assassination. It was the most talked about book at the time. Jackie Kennedy was upset about the book and wanted to review it before its publication. She was represented by the Paul Weiss Rifkind law firm. Apparently, a negotiation ensued. I remember being in the Xerox room at Greenbaum and noticing changes made by hand, such as Jackie hated X to Jackie disliked X. When the revised draft was collated, General Greenbaum, head of the firm, and yes, a real general in World War II, handed it to me in an envelope and instructed me to go downstairs, take a taxi up Madison Avenue to Paul Weiss's law offices, and most importantly, only give the envelope to Judge Rifkind. Yes, he was a prominent federal judge before joining Paul Weiss as head of the firm. That draft was probably worth millions of dollars. Der Spiegel magazine and every other publication in the world was trying to get their hands on it. Dutifully, I hailed a cab and arrived at Paul Weiss's offices. I thought it most strange that I, a simple messenger, encountered no difficulty in being ushered through winding corridors into the office of the head of such a prestigious law firm. But indeed I was. After verifying Rifkind was Rifkind, I gave him the envelope. Judge Rifkind sat me down and proceeded to find out who this young messenger was. NYU Law School, CCNY. I don't remember much about the conversation, but I was truly impressed by the interest and respect the judge showed in me. Perhaps it was our CCNY connection. So here I am, some 54 years later, along with the late Judge Rifkind, supporting our alma mater, and honoring a literary treasure our college is so fortunate to have found. Professor Dekel, it is indeed my great honor that you have been selected as the Stuart Katz Professor in the Humanities and the Arts for this academic year. Congratulations, and thank you for all you do for CCNY.
Good afternoon. I'm Renata Miller, Interim Dean of Humanities and the Arts, and it is my prerogative to introduce this evening's Katz Professor. This is the 5th year that we have granted the Stuart Z. Katz Professorship, and we are very grateful to Stuart Katz for endowing this award, which provides for a faculty member in Humanities and the Arts to pursue a truly remarkable project. In doing so, it provides an occasion for us to celebrate the research and creative work of all of our faculty in Humanities and the Arts, in departments such as English, philosophy, art, music, history, media and communication arts, classical and modern languages and literatures, theater and speech, and in our 3 interdisciplinary programs, Jewish Studies, Black Studies, and Asian Studies. I want to thank all of you who are here today, whether you're online or in person, to help us celebrate the work of our faculty. And we're going to be inviting all of you to participate in our discussion at the end of today's talk. We'll be asking you for your questions. If you're here, you'll be using the microphone in the center aisle. And if you're online, we'll be taking your questions through the Q&A feature of the program. Katz professors are chosen through a rigorous process that includes vetting both by their own departments and by an interdisciplinary panel of their peers. The previous 4 Katz professors, some of whom are here today, provide a great sense of the array of scholarly and artistic work that our faculty pursue, work that informs their teaching of City College students. Michael Holliber, professor of music, was awarded the Katz for an oratorio celebrating the work of environmentalists. Anna Indich Lopez, professor of art, for her book on Mexico City and the aesthetics of public space. Andrea Weiss, professor of film in the Department of Media and Communication Arts, for a documentary on the Berlin airlift, which was informed by her father's experience as one of its pilots. And Emily Rabbitoe, last year, professor of creative writing in the English department, for a collection of essays and photos on climate change with a particular focus on the Audubon murals in Harlem. Today, I have the honor of introducing our 5th Katz professor, Mikhal Dekel. Mikhal is professor of English. She is the author of The Universal Jew, Modernity, Masculinity, and the Zionist Movement, and the Hebrew monograph, Oedipus in Kishinev. Her 3rd and most recent book is Tehran Children, a Holocaust Refugee Odyssey. The New York Times has called Tehran Children not simply another detail of the Holocaust, but a matter of enduring existential, psychological, and moral reflection. In addition to the Times, the book has been featured in the New York Review of Books, The Guardian, the BBC, C-SPAN, TLS, and the Jewish Review of Books, among many other publications. It was a finalist for the Sami Rohr Prize, the Chautauqua Prize, and the National Jewish Book Awards. It has been translated into German and Hebrew. And it has been reissued in a paperback under the title, In the East, How My Father and 250,000 Polish Jews Survived the Holocaust. As Katz professor, Mikhal will be extending the work that she did in Tehran Children to complete her book, The Broar Near the Skater's Pond, A Return to Poland. She will also begin work on a project on restitution after mass collective trauma. But there's more to say about Mikhal. Mikhal is not only a faculty member at City College, but she is also an alumna of our own Master's in English Literature. And while she was in our MA program, before she pursued her PhD at Columbia, she worked in the dean's office when Martin Tamney was dean, and Josh Wilner, who's sitting right over there, now professor emeritus of English, was deputy dean. And I'm very happy to note that not only is Josh here today, but Tara Tamney Young, Dean Tamney's daughter, is also celebrating with us today. And Mikhal continues to serve the college above and beyond being a nationally honored researcher, as well as a highly regarded teacher and mentor. For several years as director of the Rifkind Center for the Humanities and the Arts, she has fostered a vibrant hub of ideas for our own faculty and for researchers who come to City College for the intellectual community that she has created. And I'm also very happy to note that Barbara Rifkind, patron of the Rifkind Center, is celebrating with us today, as are many faculty whose research has benefited from their participation in Rifkind Center faculty seminars. And most recently, Mikhal stepped up to serve this year as chair of the English department. And many of her colleagues from English, as well as fellow department chairs, are celebrating here with us today. And so, with gratitude for her many contributions to City College, and with admiration for her brilliant research, it is my very great honor to introduce my colleague, Mikhal Dekel.
I finally get to take this off. Sorry. Thank you so much, President Boudreau, Provost Kliss, Mr. Katz, Dean Miller, for this really generous and wonderful introduction. Thank you, all of you, Barbara Rifkind, my colleagues, my friends, students, my son, those people who are with us remotely. I know there are very many people, including my family, both in Israel and in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thank you for honoring me with your presence this afternoon. And just a word about being City College alumni. I think many people don't know that, but I was just telling Mr. Katz that in the way that City College for him was the route to get to law school, for me it was the route to leave law school. I came in 1993, just basically fresh out of law school, having just passed the bar exam in Tel Aviv University Law School. I came to New York for vacation. I was in love with New York. As the vacation was waning, I said, I don't want to go back and start real life. And people said to me, what do you want to do? I said, I want to be a writer. So somebody said to me, you know, you should go to that place on 138th Street. They have a really amazing, cheap writing program. And 30 years later, this is where I am. My first teacher was Walter Mosley. He was still not a published author. He was the guy who was doing IT in the dean's office and writing on the side. And Josh Wilner, who's here with us. So this is a really moving moment for me as well. In October 2019, I published my book, Tehran Children, which some of you have read already. 5 months later, as we know, the world closed down. Yet during those 5 months, I received 52 talk invitations, including from England, Japan, Canada, France, all major Ivy League universities, museums, Jewish cultural centers, Iranian studies programs, the Smithsonian, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Now, I'm not complaining, of course, but why? Right? I mean, why was all this attention to a semi-academic book? Now, there are several reasons, but the most prominent one is that 75 years after the end of World War II, I published a book about a story that was virtually unknown, yet belonged to roughly 250,000 Polish Jews. So the group of children that we were talking about who ended up in Tehran is 1,000 children out of a much, much larger group, which were Polish Jewish refugees who were in the Soviet interior, in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, India, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, a few of them, and so on. So among them was my father, who was 12 when the war broke out. Now, I'm not going to repeat the story of the book. Many of you read it. Those of you, as I just learned, the college will be giving out books, so hopefully you will read it if you haven't. But just very quickly, to give you the outline of the story, September 1939, Poland is invaded by both Nazi Germany and then immediately afterwards by Soviet Russia, and is partitioned. After about a month, 1.5 million of 3.5 million Polish Jews end up on the Soviet side, so in the orange side here. Of these 1.5 million Polish Jews who end up on the Soviet side, whether they fled there from the Nazi side or they simply lived in those towns that fell under Soviet occupation, about a third of them are deported to gulags in the Soviet interior. Mostly Polish Jews, but also some Polish Christians. And they're deported to gulags or slave camps across the USSR. After about 1.5 years, some, then not all, are released. And if you look at this map, you can see the route. They're basically, in the case of my family, they go from their town, Ostromazowiecka, flee to Bialystok, are deported to a gulag in Arkhangelsk, all the way up in the north, are released, and then basically go to a second exile all the way down south in Uzbekistan. From there, a minority of these refugees are evacuated to Iran, among them my father, and from Iran in a very difficult route through the Arabian Sea and the Suez Canal in Egypt to Palestine. So this is a history that was virtually unknown, or at any event not included into what we call today Holocaust history. And by that I mean is that these survivors who survived in this way were not commemorated, and they have not been commemorated. They did not receive German reparations. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum does not include their narrative among its exhibits, although in the wake of my book, they've actually started collecting people's artifacts, and hopefully they will. And now, why was that? Right? I mean, that's the obvious question. Why was this not told? Now, there are several reasons. The first has to do with what we knew and didn't know after the war. The second has to do with memory politics. To repeat, the majority of these Polish Jews survived, though in horrific conditions, because they were deported not by Nazis to concentration camps, but by the Soviets to gulags. The reason they avoided, I mean, as we know, the Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union. The reasons why these people who were on the Soviet side were not murdered is because they were deported so far northeast, so far to into the Soviet interior, that the Nazis didn't make it far enough to kill them. So they were saved by their deportations. Until the fall of the USSR, we didn't know very much about gulags. I mean, we had Solzhenitsyn's memoir, but that was a memoir that was based on his experience and the experiences of others. We had no access to archives. So only in the late 1980s, we started getting some information on what the lives of these prisoners would have been like in the gulags. Now, those archives, which by the way are much less open today than they were in the early 1990s, so under Putin a lot of them have been closed. What we know now, after those archives have been opened, are a few things. We know, first of all, that the Gulag was not constructed in order to kill people, but that it was nevertheless lethal. What made the Gulag lethal was its inhumanity. In 1940, for example, I interviewed many of these survivors, and a lot of them say, when they talk about the fact that they were deported, rather than remaining on the border, they will say to me, almost all of them will say, I did something stupid. For example, I refused to take a Soviet passport, or I got a KGB officer upset, and therefore they deported me. So people present this as a kind of story of personal agency, but in fact, it was not at all a story of personal agency. What would happen, for example, in the case of my father, is that a company, let's say the All Union Timber Amalgamation Company in Arkhangelsk, would be assigned to fix a certain segment of the railway in northern Soviet Union. They would send a request to the central administration. It would be approved. It would be sent to the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, and they would say, we need 5,000 laborers, and the NKVD would go and arrest 5,000 people, including my father and his family. And so what made this lethal is the fact that really the prisoners were not human. They were sort of ingredients of production, like lumps of coal, cheap, expendable, and if there was not enough food for them, you could always get new ones. In 1992, they did some interviews with former Gulag officials. Alexei Loginov, for example, who is the former deputy director of the Norilsk camp in the Arctic Circle. When they asked him, why did you need to so much slave labor, he said, if we had sent civilians, we would have first had to build houses for them to live in. We would have had to build cities. And how could civilians live there anyway? This is talking about, for example, in Arkhangelsk with minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. With prisoners, it was easy. All you needed is a barrack, a stove with a chimney, and they survive. And of course, many didn't survive. The statistics are not completely clear, but minimally 25% of the prisoners died, which of course we know is still a better statistic than people who were sent to Auschwitz. Now, of all of these, so we know that there were at least 467 different camp systems during the Soviet era, each made up of hundreds of individual camps, and it would be one central log post with dozens of forestry stations around it, sometimes spread over thousands of miles of open tundra, each one containing anywhere from dozens to thousands of prisoners. And I actually traveled those routes, including, I had a kind of fantasy that I have to at least relive some of this route, which of course you can't relive, but to the degree that I could. So I traveled a 29-hour train ride from Moscow to Komi, where many of the prisoners were sent. And you do travel basically through 29 hours of open tundra, just forest, nothing else practically. And this was what would happen to the prisoners. They would be put on a kind of a cargo train and shipped off and dropped off after 2 weeks, and maybe some died on the way and maybe some didn't because there was very little food or water. Now, all these thousands of camps and millions of prisoners, there is not one piece of footage. And very few photos. Oh, what did I do? This is one of them, and as you can see, it's not very memorable or personal. So if you think about the events that are memorialized in your head, the images of 9/11, the napalm girl, the photos of the death camps when they were liberated, you will know that memorialization is always tied to the visual image. The Nazis photographed their crimes extensively, particularly in the early stages. The first murder of Jews, a mass murder of Jews in Nazi-occupied Poland, took place in my father's hometown of Ostromazowiecka, and I'm going to be showing some graphic images, which unfortunately are realistic. That happened on November 11th, 1939. Both the German executioners and Polish bystanders photographed this event extensively. They photographed people walking to their execution, townspeople walking to they were executed maybe half a kilometer away from the city center. They photographed people kneeling at the ditch just before execution, and they photographed their bodies, their corpses, right after their execution. And there are many of these photos. And so the first reason why the story remained obscure for decades was really limited information and definitely limited visual images. Even today, it's very hard to make a documentary about the Gulag because of that. The second reason why the story hasn't been told, is political. Still today in Russia, 3 decades after the end of communism, the Gulag is not officially commemorated. Human rights activists collect lists of names of prisoners, half clandestinely. Occasionally, you will find grassroots memorials like this one. So I photographed this memorial while I'm traveling in Komi. This was built by the daughter of a Gulag prisoner someone who died in the Gulag. She lives in Germany now, and so it's a kind of grassroots tribute. But you don't see sort of governmental, official tributes. In contemporary Russia, the past bleeds unconsciously into the present, unprocessed, unmemorialized, in plain sight, yet hidden. Places where the prisoners were buried are not cemeteries. They're vast fields with thousands of mounds of earth, sometimes located right outside towns. And I'm going to play you a very, very short video, a few seconds. So when I was in Komi, I had a translator and a human rights activist who were taking me around. And I mean, this girl actually grew up in this town. She grew up 20 minutes from here. She never heard about this. She never heard that there are gulags and people died there and so on. So basically, they kind of took me on a Jeep and said, you go here, you go here. They take me into this forest, and then they're like, here. And you'll see, I mean, you can't see any, oops, sorry. Again?
It's near 1 kilometer of this cemetery.
So this is the cemeteries all around here of prisoners that or workers that were buried of the gulags, 1 kilometer diameter. One of the reasons why this is such a horrible video is because they kept saying, don't film, don't film, don't film. And I was kind of sneaking in like these short segments. But this is, so 1 kilometer, and I think it was more because I started walking it, of basically mounds of earth here and there across. That's it. And so this has not been turned into any kind of memorial site. And I should say that in general, traveling to those areas and researching in those areas today was, I mean, these areas are still very Soviet. I mean, I was, when I got there, I had 2 plainclothes policemen following me around everywhere. I actually needed the intervention of something of a mini oligarch to get into the archives, because otherwise somehow they're always closed when you need them. And so it's still a very touchy subject. In Uzbekistan, where I also traveled in 2013, the situation in some ways was worse because, you know, that was, especially in 2013, was a hardline dictatorship. You couldn't really travel there as an independent researcher. I traveled there as a tourist on the Silk Road, and I had a clandestine research assistant who was helping me on the side and also kept telling me, Professor, you know, be careful. And so these are not areas that you can research well, and these are not areas, I mean, there are no memorials in Uzbekistan for basically the thousands and thousands of starving people who simply died of starvation just in the streets. When at the time in 1941, when the streets of Samarkand and Bukhara were just strewn with corpses of starving people. But what about memorialization outside Russia and the former USSR? Wouldn't these survivors I wrote about have written memoirs, have written their stories? First of all, we have to remember that many of them remained in Russia. And many of them weren't repatriated after the war, so they remained in Russia, and then many of them basically got caught behind the Iron Curtain, and Russia became their home. And I met with those people. To me, that was one of the shocking things of my trips, because we think of our identity, we think of who we are as just who we are, right? It's sort of thinking, I'm Israeli. But really, when I was traveling, I realized that for what were for my father, the points of transit were for many people, for most people, endpoints. So people remained in the gulags or in towns near the gulags. People remained in Uzbekistan. I would see a kind of versions of what I could have been, like the Uzbek Mikhal, the Russian Mikhal, Iranian Mikhal, what I could have been if that was the case. And so many of these people stayed in Russia, and of course couldn't really talk, or and in a way didn't really have a story. Others were able to leave. Some, like my father, as I said, were evacuated from Central Asia to Tehran, and later from Tehran to Tel Aviv in the middle of the war, and I'll say more about that in a minute, in 1943. Others were repatriated to Poland after the war, and either remained in Poland or ended up in displaced persons camps, and then in Israel or in the United States or Canada. So what happened to the story in Israel and in North America and in Poland? After the war, of course, we know Poland became a communist country, so of course that story would remain silent there for another half a century. In the United States in 1945, of course, the Soviets were the liberators, right? They were liberators. Not very Americans wanted to hear the story of slave camps run by the liberators, right? And even during the Cold War, not very many people wanted to hear that. Even less people, of course, wanted to hear that in Israel. In 1948, Stalin came to Israel's aid in the 1948 war. And of course, as we know, Israel until 1977 was a semi-socialist country. Now, so that you couldn't tell that story either. In Israel, where I was born and raised, my father and other children who were evacuated from Tehran to Tel Aviv, like him, are known as the Tehran Children. That is, or Yaldei Tehran in Hebrew. That's why the name of my book. The Tehran Children were taken out of Central Asia, out of the USSR, in a few batches, but basically in 1942, and in 1943, they were evacuated to Palestine, or the land of Israel. In Israel, if you would have asked me if my father is a survivor, I would have said no. He's not a survivor, he's a Tehran child. Tehran Children were, this was a heroic story. This was a story that was told as the story of the heroic rescue of Jewish children by the budding Jewish state. In 1943, when these children arrived from Egypt by train, the entire Jewish population of Palestine came out to greet them. Schools were closed. School children came out with flowers. People were holding flags. This was the first group of survivors to arrive. I mean, you have a group of children coming from Europe in the middle of the war. This is February 1943. Now, all of these Jews in Palestine, they have families in Poland. They don't know what is happening with them. People are screaming names at these children. They're like, did you see Sarah and so and so and so on? So these children were sort of this phenomenon. Everybody wanted to see them, and there was a huge war in Israel about who was going to raise them. And so this is it kind of, when I interviewed people in Israel above a certain age, they all say, I remember the day the Tehran Children came, like I remember the day that Kennedy was shot. So I grew up in Israel thinking of my father's story as this optimistic, heroic story, almost like the Kindertransport that we know better. But with what I know now, and I know what these children suffered in those 4 years of parents and siblings lost, of severe physical and mental health issues, of acute starvation, of rape, of small children sleeping in the streets of Samarkand among corpses, oftentimes of their parents. So why wasn't that part told to me? Where was the Elie Wiesel of this story, the Primo Levi of this story? Turns out there was an Elie Wiesel of the Gulag. His name was Julius Margolis, and he was a Polish Jewish philosopher who also went through this route, was deported to the gulags after the war, and he made it to Tel Aviv in 1946, immediately started writing what he went through, completed his memoirs, which are called Journey into the Land of Zeks and Back, in 1947. And of course, in Israel in 1947, could find no publisher, because as I said, nobody wanted to hear the story of Soviet atrocities. Among the Russian, of course he couldn't publish it in Russia, among the Russian diaspora, there was a question of Margolin's Jewishness. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who would go on to publish the seminal Gulag book, Gulag Archipelago, outside Russia, of course. He is rumored to have blocked Margolin's book because he saw it as too narrowly focused on the Jewish experience. So he wanted to tell the story of the Gulag as a kind of universal Christian experience. When was Margolin's unabridged book finally published? In France in 2010. Sorry. This is Margolis, by the way. I'm like not too good at doing these two things together. This book was published in France in 2010. It was published in Israel in 2013, and in English only this year by Oxford University Press, with an introduction by the prominent historian Timothy Snyder, who actually also spoke here at the Rifkind Center a few years ago. And he was actually just this last week, the New York Review books covered Margolis' book together with my book in its latest issue. So it seems that we're finally ready, or at least ready in Israel and Western Europe and America, to incorporate this narrative into the corpus of Holocaust literature. Poland is a different case. Poland has been telling the story of the Gulag for several decades now, basically since Poland became, since the end of communism, so since the early 1990s. But the story is told in Poland not as the survival story of Holocaust refugees, but as the story of Soviet aggression against the Polish nation and Christian Poles. So this is a memorial in Warsaw that was built in 1995. It's a memorial for the martyrs and fallen of the East. And as you can see, it's a memorial of crosses. And there is also a kind of, with a white eagle, which is the national symbol of Poland. And to be fair, there is actually a little tiny Star of David that's in there, but you can't really see it. It's hidden. And so the story that is told in Poland basically is the story of the Christian Poles and Polish POWs who were murdered by the Soviets. In fact, in Poland and elsewhere in Eastern and Central Europe, the Gulag and the concentration camp are often seen as two symbols of what is called the double genocide, right? What is the idea behind the double genocide? It is, so the Holocaust against the Jews perpetrated by the Germans, by the Nazis, and a second genocide perpetrated by the Soviets against ethnic Poles, ethnic Lithuanians, ethnic Estonians, and so on. So these countries don't view themselves as having been liberated in 1944, but as having remained under Soviet occupation for nearly half a century after 1944. And I should say that traveling in Russia was also very illuminating to me in understanding what people don't know about the Holocaust outside the United States and Europe and Israel and so on. I mean, when I was in Komi on my last day, I was interviewed in a local radio station. And as I told you, everybody knew where I was going because they were following me around. So they knew there was this American professor. So they said, we will invite you to this radio show. So I did this talk show, and then young woman, very lovely, said to me, so I want to ask you, what do you think about Stalin? And I said, look, in my father's story, Stalin was better than Treblinka. And she said, what's Treblinka? Which really brought home to me that things that we assume here are not really happening elsewhere in terms of memory and historical knowledge. Now, in Poland today, therefore, it's problematic to tell the story that I tell as a story of Jewish victims, because in some ways that makes there's a kind of competition, right? So what is preventing the story from being told in Poland is really, to put it crudely, a competition of suffering between Jews and ethnic Poles. So therefore, if the Jews also suffered from the Soviets and the Nazis, that's not good optics. And I should say that my book actually was recently rejected for publication in Poland, and the peer reviewer said, oh, the Poles already know the story, they don't need to be told the story again. And I mean, hopefully it will come out, and there's another publisher considering it, but still, it was telling that was the case. Moreover, since the rise of the conservative right Law and Justice Party in Poland in 2015, this government has been promoting a narrative by which it was ethnic Poles were not only targeted by the Soviets, but were targeted en masse by both the Soviets and the Nazis, right? So there's been running a campaign to show how much Christian Poles suffered under the Soviets, and if you look at this graph, it's pretty telling. This is a poll that was taken by the Polish Center for Public Research in February of this year. And as you can see, so the orange are people who think Poles and Jews suffered the same during the war. The gray is Jews suffered more, and the blue is the blue is Jews suffered more, and the gray is Poles suffered more. So if you take the orange and the gray together, you will see that this year, 71% of the Polish citizens questioned said that ethnic Poles, Christian Polish citizens suffered equally or more than Jews during the Holocaust. Right? 71%, that's a big number. Now, I came to face to face with these ideas when I was hosted in Poland by really one of the main architects of contemporary memory politics in Poland, Polish Deputy Minister of Culture, Dr. Magdalena Gawin. As it happens, by one of those mysterious things that happen in life, Gawin's Catholic father and my Jewish father hail from the same Polish town, Ostromazowiecka. When we met in 2014, so a year before she was not a politician, she was simply an academic like me. She heard from someone in Poland that I was researching this town, and she wrote to me and invited me to Poland, and in her email she wrote that she was inviting me to a ceremony commemorating her great aunt, whom she said had hidden Jews in an inn owned in town and was murdered by Ostrov's Gestapo. So I just get this email out of the blue, and I'm thinking, who is this person? What's going on? But of course, I'm too curious not to go, so I go. And now, by the time she wrote me, I had already done enough research that I knew that Ostrov's Gestapo was located inside a beer brewery that was owned by my family. And this is the brewery. This is what it looked like in 1938. Hundreds and perhaps thousands were tortured and killed inside the brewery, nearly all of them Polish Jews, including children who were trying to reach the nearby Soviet border. So after that mass massacre that you saw, there were not very many Jews left, local Jews left there, but it was a border town. And one of the reasons why we know that they killed everybody is because they didn't want locals helping people cross the border. And so we have testimonies of what went on inside this brewery. At the end of the war, basically the people who were living there and the people who were the Gestapo burnt the brewery down. After the war, it was nationalized by the Polish government, and then after that, it was basically made into sort of a huge elementary school, which still stands there, and that's me there in 2013. At the entrance to the brewery, okay, so this is at the entrance to the brewery, turned Gestapo headquarters, turned school, now lies a stone memorial that reads, and this is the memorial, I'm going to read you the translation in English. It says, "This place was sanctified by the martyr blood of Poles fighting for freedom during the Hitlerite occupation of 1939 to 1944. This memorial, in other words, is a commemoration of Polish Christian heroism, erected at a site where nearly all those murdered had been Polish Jews, and on a property that belonged to and essentially was stolen from my Jewish family. Still, I traveled to Poland, and I spent 5 days in Ostrów Mazowiecka with Gowan. And it was very, very interesting 5 days. And one of the reasons I traveled is because by that point I had been so deep into my research. I traveled to Russia, Uzbekistan, Israel. I met many former exiles, Jewish and non-Jewish, survivors, descendants of the living and the dead. And I really came to the conclusion that none of us, not even people who had been completely destroyed, had exclusivity on suffering. And so I was truly open to hearing that, and I was curious also to learn of the fate of the town's Christian Polish residents from a Polish source. And indeed, during my visit, Gowan schooled me in the story of wartime suffering of Christian Poles, and particularly her great aunt. She was warm and generous and genuinely sad and sympathetic to the fate of the Jews, but her focus remained on the sacrifice, the goodness, and the heroism of her great aunt, and the abuses and torture she and the general Christian Polish population suffered at the hands of the Nazis. When I challenged Gowan's views of the locals as uniformly good, hapless victims, because I had read enough and interviewed enough people to know that not everybody was good and an innocent victim, and in fact it was quite the opposite. She would always deflect it. She would say our townspeople were traditional, they were religious, they were radical, and they were not violent. They did not, and so we had this kind of polite but somewhat tense exchange over 5 days where I would sort of push her and she would say, I would say, look, my father told me that there are like these pogromchiks, like in small pogroms in this town, and she would say, those were people from out of town, they were not our people, they were not our, and so, but it remained, I left Poland feeling still that she was a good person and that she had a kind of rosier picture. This was the, okay, that was like one person's fantasy. Having said that, before I left, she asked for my help in locating the Jews her great aunt had presumably hid, and for whose rescue she had presumably died. So it turned out that she actually didn't have hard evidence for that at all. To be fair, to this day, I don't know whether her great aunt was an unjustly forgotten hero or an invented hero. I think she was killed, but I don't know that I don't know. I haven't seen any evidence that it was for harboring Jews and so on. So I don't know this. What I do know is that a year after my visit, Gowan was appointed as Poland's Deputy Minister of Culture and National Heritage, a post she now holds for the second term. Gowan's great aunt, Jadwiga Długoborska, is now memorialized in a monument of her own. This is also on my family's property. This is Gowan herself at the ceremony. And again, I can't tell you if this is, I know she was not, let's put this, Yad Vashem, which is the Israeli Holocaust Center, which grants the honor for righteous Gentiles, rejected her. What Gowan and other people in the Polish government claim is that the Yad Vashem's criteria are too strict, and so on. The Polish government in the 5 years has erected dozens of monuments like this, as well as a museum and a national holiday devoted to Poles murdered for saving Jews. A branch of this museum is actually due to open soon in New York, I should say. The Polish government has also opened research centers for studying the two totalitarianisms, the Soviet and the Nazi. It has outlawed blaming Poland for the Holocaust. And some of you have been following this. There's a famous trial for Holocaust historians who've recently been put on trial for that. And luckily, the appeals court has exonerated them, but we'll see what happens with that. And finally, just recently, the Polish government passed a law, or the Polish, not government, but SZEM, whatever it's called, passed a law that outlaws restitution of pre-World War II properties. So just as I was ready to finally do something about all this property in Poland, now that has been outlawed. So here too, as in Russia, so in Russia we have Putin basically remobilizing Soviet history. I mean, he's brought back the Soviet anthem and so on, basically in order to further his aims. I mean, the more sort of anti-Western sentiment is in Russia, the better for his rule. I mean, and after all, he is an ex-KGB officer. In Poland too, some of this has nothing to do with Jews. I mean, some of it is basically economic, right? Because we're talking about a lot of stolen property, as well as political. And it's very hard to understand the politics of this, but really what the Polish government is saying in some way is Germany of the past brutalized and occupied and brutalized us, and therefore Germany of the present, i.e. leader of the EU, cannot dictate its terms to us either. It cannot tell us that we need to, take in refugees or protect gay rights or even celebrate the Holocaust, commemorate the Holocaust in a certain way. And we see this in Hungary too, and in other countries. So the sort of this narrative of Poland as a victim has political goals in the present. Now, it is hard as well as scary to fight such entrenched and often aggressively promoted historical narratives. If the nation, as Benedict Anderson writes, is more like a family than an ideology, then one who goes against the family will pay, let alone if that family puts millions towards historical revisionism. And yet in Poland and also in Lithuania, Hungary, and elsewhere in Eastern and Central Europe, conscientious historians and memory activists, armed with the archive and facing indifference, hatred, and sometimes organized campaigns, work tirelessly to expose the facts and the mechanisms of distortion. So there really are, I think, amazing scholars and academics in any one of these countries, and especially in Poland, who are working very hard against these sort of government promoted narratives. I too, after much deliberation, decided to publish a newspaper article in Poland about my adventures in Ostrov with Minister Gowin. Because of my research, I'm very close to some Polish historians, and people are saying, you had this amazing opportunity. You basically spent 5 days with this person that is now the architect of major revisionism, and why don't you write something about it? And I was very conflicted because on a personal level, I liked Gowin, and also I just didn't want to deal with hatred that I knew would come from Polish nationalists and on social media and so on, and it did come. But at the end, I decided that I did have a unique perspective, and I had the privileges of a tenured professor in the United States, and if I don't publish, then it's wrong, right? Because people are putting themselves in line in these places. So I published the article in Gazeta Wyborcza, which is like the New York Times of Poland, and they published it in the first page, and it was very moving. And this is what I wrote, and I wrote the whole story, and I wrote about our exchanges, and I wrote, someone, presumably me, would have to protest the historical inaccuracy of commemorating only Christian Poles in the brewery. But what would I be fighting for exactly? A monument at the entrance to the former Tidal brewery that would state, "Here stood the Tidal Brothers Brewery"? An amendment to the brewery's monument for the martyr blood of Poles fighting for freedom, which would turn it into the martyr blood of Jews murdered by the Nazis and Poles fighting for freedom? Morally speaking, could these two groups even coexist in the same fantasized monument? And this, I think, is the main question in situations of of competitive or revised histories, which, after all, is not unique to Poland, and we're dealing with some of that even here in the United States. Because as angry as I was and still am about historical revisionism in Poland, and despite the fact that there was no genocide of the general non-Jewish Polish population, and this is in Poland, but also in other places in Eastern Europe, people did suffer at the hands of the Nazis and the Soviets. In Poland and elsewhere, even if we removed all the propaganda and all the injustice, and there is a lot of injustice. There's a book that was just published by the granddaughter of a Lithuanian general who is general celebrated in Lithuania for fighting the Soviets, and he has all kinds of streets named after him. And his granddaughter, who's a teacher here in Chicago, was asked to write his biography by her family, and the grandfather they all adored. And she went to the archives. She found out that he was actually a Nazi that deported 20,000 Jews, including many children. And so a lot of times, actually, these war heroes who fought the Soviets were in fact Nazis, and sometimes they were commemorated. This was a kind of guise for them to not be caught, so they would be just commemorated as war heroes who fought the Soviets. But I think even if we were able to remove all of that injustice and all of that revisionism and all of that propaganda, the hard questions would still remain. To whom does history belong? Whose history gets to be told? Must we each be the guardians of our own particular history? And is our only option a zero-sum competition between historical narratives that must necessarily cancel each other out? It is tempting to say that there is room for every group's historical trauma, but as we just saw, it's not so easy. We live today in a polarized society in which the right is the keeper of exclusive national histories and the left calls for analogies that usually begin with the sentence, "You have no right to speak about X without speaking about Y," right? And if we move away from Poland and the Jews, there are people, let's say in Germany, who are saying to Germany, "You have no right to commemorate the Holocaust if you're neglecting to commemorate your brutal colonization of Namibia." I think we have to find a way to talk about multiple histories of collective trauma beyond these two options. What that will look like, I'm still not sure. I hope to have some ideas after my next book, or in my next book. I do think it begins with a few things. I think it begins with a deep and precise as possible understanding of the historical situation, a deep and precise as possible understanding of the memory politics in play, and empathy for others, but also maybe first and foremost for yourself and your people. This process is not about, as those of you who read my book know, simply reaching down into the deep well called the past and retrieving it whole, but understanding the factors that have shaped the ways you and others have remembered or forgotten your history. It takes digging into archives, corroborating, traveling, interviewing, modifying interpretations of the past as needed, plowing through a landscape of contested histories, and simply sitting with the material for a long, long time, letting it sink in. This requires both time and money, which most of us academics, and especially those of us in public universities, don't have an abundance of. And this is why the Katz Professorship and fellowship like it can really have a tremendous impact. Some memory studies scholars today are calling for what they call slow memory, with the idea that, like cooking slow food, slowing down our research methods will better help us build capacity, generate knowledge, and have impact. In an age of contested histories, that seems to me like a great first step. Thank you. This is the cover. This is the cover of the paperback. As you can see, my publisher W.W. Norton actually changed the title and the cover. Which I'm not sure what I think about, but the idea was that with Tehran Children, many people thought, oh, this is a book about Persian children. So, for example, one of the reasons why the New York Review of Books covered it only now, 2 years after it came out, is because the woman who covered it said, oh, I thought it was a book about Iran, so I wasn't really interested. So they wanted to emphasize the fact that this is a much bigger book than just the Tehran, and also to emphasize the memoir aspect. And so this will come out in December. So thank you again.
We're going to be taking questions from the audiences now. For those of you who are here in person, please step up to the microphone in the center aisle, and we'll also be taking questions from our online audience through the Q&A feature.
Good afternoon. I enjoyed your talk very much. And in 1939, when the USSR invaded half of Poland, they deported my mother, my aunt, my grandmother to Uzbekistan. However, they arrested my grandfather and kept him. So the question is, and the mystery is, what happened to my grandfather? What is your opinion? Is it likely that the Russians killed him? Or is it likely that the USSR kept him as a prisoner, and when the Germany invaded that part of Poland, they're the ones who killed him?
Stay there for a minute. So you're saying that they were deported separately to separate camps?
Correct. My grandfather was not deported. He was kept in Poland, in Rozhny out of Poland. But my mother, my aunt, and my grandmother were deported to Uzbekistan. Then my grandmother switched my mother's name and my aunt's name so she could send her to Tehran. So my aunt became one of the Yaldei Tehran because my grandmother changed their name. But my grandfather, he stayed in Rozhny out of Poland. The USSR authorities kept him there. So he was never sent to the gulags. So our family never knew what really happened to him. So the question is, what is your opinion? What's most likely happened to him?
So here, if we go back to the map, yeah, yes, most likely he was killed, because if you look at the map, or actually, let's look at this one. So many people, my family escaped on September 6th, 1939. So many people, the war started and people weren't sure what to do. I interviewed a lot of people and people said, we just didn't know what to do. We didn't know who would be worse, the Germans or the Russians, right? And of course, we have to remember that they already went through World War I. They already went through 2 occupations, and in the eyes of many people, the Germans were actually a better choice out of 2 bad choices. So some people fled, like my family, and some people didn't. In the case of my family, they fled a kind of huge extended family. Some of them were not deported. They fled to the Soviet side, but some of them were not deported to the gulags. They stayed basically. When the Soviets invaded the Soviet Union, yes, they killed them. They killed them, or they kept them in ghettos in Bialystok, and then later on they shipped them off to Treblinka. So most likely your grandfather was killed by the Nazis. Now, your family that was saved in Uzbekistan. One of the extraordinary things that has happened with this book is that, and this is maybe the most satisfying thing of this whole journey that I've had with the book, is that many people contact me who are descendants of people who ended up in Uzbekistan and in other places, and including the woman who wrote the New York Review of Books piece this weekend or last weekend. And people write me and they say, I'm shocked today I got it even. Somebody said, I was shocked reading your book. My grandmother was in Uzbekistan. I thought she was the only one. Now, I'm just told you that 250,000 people do this route. And this really brought home to me the importance of writing books and writing histories and memorializing, because if you don't know the history, you actually can think that you're the only one in a situation that belonged to so many. So many people survived in this way. In fact, most Polish Jews who survived, out of 350,000 Polish Jews who survived, 10% of Polish Jews who were there before the war, about 230 to 250 were people who survived in this way. And what happened to her after? Did they remain in Uzbekistan? The children left, but did she remain in Uzbekistan?
No. After the war, World War II, my mother and my grandmother came back to Poland, whereas my aunt went to Tehran and later on to Tel Aviv. And after 1950, that's when my mother and grandmother moved to Israel, and then they were reunited with my aunt.
Thank you.
We have a question from one of our guests online. Gerald Harris writes, how does the story of Polish Jewish partisans connect to the history that you have recorded?
It doesn't really connect. I mean, it connects to the story I just ended with about the commemorations in Poland of Polish Christian heroism. Where do you place the Jews who were actually part of the Polish resistance and were partisans and so on, and that's it's a complicated question in terms of how Poland is memorializing things. I don't know what to answer. It's not really part of the story that I tell. I already tell a big enough story as it is.
I'm going to encourage people to step up to the microphone in the center aisle if people who are here have questions, and people online can continue to enter their questions in the chat. And here we'll go with the live question from President Boudreau.
Mikhal, you talked about the production of historical memory in Poland. What about in Iran? What do Iranians say about their role in all of this? Is there any kind of public memorialization? Has the country turned away from what they might have seen as a heroic moment in their history?
You asked about Iran, yes?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating question. Iran, I mean, Iranians in general don't know the story. To the extent that they know the story, they know it as the story of the Poles who came to Iran, because most of the refugees who ended up in Iran were Polish Christians. The Polish Jews were embedded among these, but they weren't. So they don't. A lot of them are really surprised to hear actually that there were Jews among these refugees, and there actually were. Since the book came out, I learned so much stuff that I actually incorporated into the paperback. One of the things that I learned was there were more people than I thought, more Jews in Iran than I thought, because there was the official way to get there and the unofficial way to get there. Right? As the questionnaire just said, people changed their name to sort of Catholic names, and so they could go with the Christian Poles, or they had all kinds of fictitious marriages and so on. So there are a lot of people or they are stowaways. So in Iran in general, they know a little bit about the Polish refugees who were there. They don't know so much about the Jews who were there. Now, as you know, my colleague Salar Abda, I couldn't travel to Iran, obviously. I mean, I could. I don't know if I would return from Iran, but I mean, I'm Israeli, and I have an Israeli passport, and I was in the army, so not a good idea for me. But I had somebody researching for me in Iran, and I had a few people researching, and especially my colleagues and friend Salar, and who helped me quite a bit on this book. So, you know, here people know about this book in Iran. I've given a few talks in Iranian studies programs. An Iranian media company based in London made a film about this book, and it's a 25-minute film with the idea. I mean, it's obviously this is a media company in exile, but they sneak this stuff into Iran, and I mean, they felt like this would be a great way to do Holocaust education in Iran, because it's about Iran actually, and it's a pretty good story about Iran. I don't know. I have no idea, reactions to that. When the book came out, there was some talk about translating the book to Farsi and publishing it in Iran. Since then, first of all, Iran is not a signatory on any copyright agreement. So I was very keen on publishing it in Iran. I said, do it for free, because otherwise I knew that somebody will butcher it and take out the parts and create a new book out of it. we were talking, Salar was talking to some publishers and so on, but since then the situation has escalated. So I mean, with especially after Soleimani's killing, it's very hard, I think, to publish a book by somebody who is nominally an Israeli writer, and it's also a book. It's a book in which Iran comes out positively because it ended up, harboring Jews. But it's also, there are parts there where people from the Zionist Agency of Palestine come to Iran and so on. And there's actually one testimony where somebody says, in Iran, Zionism became a mass movement. I just don't think people in charge in Iran would like to hear that today. But we'll see. I mean, the future, I don't know what will happen in the future. But it's been, so one of the things that has happened with this book about Iran, and also, I mean, with everybody, I always say everybody is a little bit mad at me, like the Jews, the Iranians, because, I mean, everybody loves me a little bit, and depending on where they are politically. I mean, I think there's definitely people who are very happy about this book in Iran, and Iran is outside Iran. I gave a big talk at Stanford, Iranian Studies, and the guy who runs that program loves that book. But also the people who don't like a story that even nominally is about some reconciliation.
One of our former Katz professors, Anna Indich Lopez, is celebrating with us online, and she writes, I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors who were supposedly spared by escaping to Russia. They could never talk about their experiences. So my question is about method. Given your extensive oral history research, how did you find the experience of speaking with survivors or descendants? And how do you, as a scholar, navigate the personal with the historical?
Again, a great question. It's true that none of these people, I've not heard of one person that went through this journey who spoke. So we know that survivors in general don't speak, but that's not exactly true. I mean, with people over time, if people are invited to give talks and so they survive. And there are two reasons. I think one is psychological, right? Because these were the lucky ones, right? I mean, these were the people who actually weren't sent to the gas chambers. And so in the case of my father, for example, and the Tehran Children, in 1943, when they get when there's a big ceremony, everybody in Tel Aviv, everybody's treating them as the survivors. But in 1945, suddenly they're the lucky ones. They're not the survivors because people have learned what happened. People have learned that there was a complete genocide. And so suddenly these people had no story. Secondly is because for all the reasons that I just spoke about, it's like there is no framework through which to tell your story. So how do you even begin to, people write me all the time and people will say, somebody just wrote me and they said, we have some questions about my grandmother with some like sexual violence in Iran, and could that be? And I was like, yes, it could be. I have concrete evidence to that. But because they're like, oh my God, we always thought she made that up. So you have to have, it takes two to speak about something like this. I mean, you have to have willingness to speak, and you have to have a willingness to listen, and you can't listen, and you don't have a willingness if you don't understand anything about the story. So that was hard. But I did find that the moment, and I'll give you the example. So my father, unfortunately, died many years ago in 1993. And but my aunt, his younger sister, who was with him throughout, just died last year. And she helped me a lot. I was very lucky. She had an amazing memory. And in the beginning, she was totally, why do you need this? Focus on your literature. But the more I knew, the more she was willing to speak. So once I knew a lot and I knew what to ask, everybody wanted to speak. And not just talking about Israel and these survivors, but also people in Uzbekistan and Russia and so on. Navigating the personal and Archival, because this is really, it's a book that is incredibly intimate. It's really, I mean, I really bared my soul and my relationship with my father and with other people, but it's also very scholarly. I mean, I spent 10 years of research and fact-checking and whatnot. I felt it had to be that way. I mean, I felt like you can't really separate the emotional and personal from the factual, because it's not really just, as I said before, it's not really just a story that I dug up whole. I mean, it's sort of piecing it together and understanding it through the prism of who I am today, I think was important to me. And I think a lot of people relate to that when they read the book.
Hello, Mikhal. Thank you very much for the talk, and thank you for your book. You ask at the very end, what is the best way forward? And it seems to me that maybe one way forward is, instead of focusing so much, as all of us do, on the end, on how people died and how people survived, what happened during those years, that we also concentrate more perhaps about the life that was before everything happened. That might be kind of a common ground for people to come together rather than to fight. And in your own experience in having done so much, regarding your father, regarding these different memory cultures, could you say something about how the life of this great Eastern European Jewish civilization was like before the end arrived? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. I agree. I agree that we need to focus on people's lives, and I think, for example, the Poland Museum in Warsaw, the Poland Museum of the History of the Jews is focused very much. I mean, they keep saying, well, we were focusing on 1,000 years of Polish Jewish life in Poland and not just at the end. But I actually think it's very important to understand the end. I think it's very important. I mean, you can't just say, I'm going to ignore it. I mean, of course, you don't need to focus just on that. But for me, at least, personally, the Holocaust was like this big mammoth thing that was so overwhelming, and just knowing the facts, knowing exactly what happened in each given moment, I think it's very important. Otherwise, it becomes this sort of amorphous thing. So I absolutely think it's both are important. Having said that, and I'm writing about this now, I think Polish Jewry, the life of Polish Jews was just, it was an incredible civilization, and what's so horrible about it is that we don't even have, even though many historians work on this, we can't even imagine it, because it's not part of our world in any way. I mean, it's a civilization it was so erased. So we can think about Kafka, we can think about sort of German Jewish writers or French, but somehow Polish Jewish writers and Polish Jewish filmmakers, we don't even have access to that world that is both pious and modern and everything that it meant. In the case of my family, I mean, they lived 8 generations in that town in Ostromozhoviechka, so they lived there longer than most sort of Christian Poles, and they were incredibly established, and they had, not the later generations, but the earlier generations, each had like 7, 8 kids, so they were like a huge clan, and they did different things, and I read a lot of their materials, and so it was an incredible civilization, but it's hard to know how to represent it right, because they were not completely assimilated. This was not Proust. This is not a completely assimilated population, but it's also not completely what we imagine of like Fiddler on the Roof and the shtetl and so on. I mean, there's a big middle class. that are sort of pious, but they dress like Christian Poles and so on, and go to Polish gymnasium. I found out, for example, that my great-grandfather actually was paid for the construction of the Polish gymnasium, or a large part of the philanthropy, a large part of the Polish gymnasium in their hometown, because their kids went there with mostly Christian children. So it's, it's not here to talk about this whole civilization, and it's also there are better people than me to talk about it, because there are historians who work on this. But I agree with it. It's a rich, rich world that we haven't tapped about, and one of the challenges is to think about how to talk about it. Because how do you talk? I mean, how do you talk about all the happy stuff when there was complete destruction of,
Hi. When I read the book in 2019, and you and I talked about this was at a time when we had a child refugee crisis at the southern border of the United States. And, I found myself, when reading the book, reflecting so much on the modern situation. And wanted to just hear your thoughts on, in this narrative, is it just sort of so specific to its place and its time and its context and the people who endured it, or are there insights that you drew and that we can draw for thinking about what continues to be a very political and contested, very much as it was in Asia and in Europe, sort of narrative about who are these children, what do they represent politically for these nations in conflict, and how can we think about this as a human rights issue and a political issue in a way that is, in the best interest of the children?
Thank you. No. I mean, I don't think it's. Yes and no, right? I mean, of course, it's specific, and it's not. Maybe this is such a terrible situation because these kids, let's say, they're not just refugees. I mean, first they're deportees and they're refugees, but also they live in a world where, the whole world has been disseminated, when most of their families have been murdered. And one of the amazing things about following such a story, I'm reading, let's say, letters that were sent from Uzbekistan, and people keep writing, does anybody know where so-and-so is? So people have already been killed, but the people who are in Uzbekistan don't know that they were killed. So it's very specific, but it's also I think it's wrong to just keep it within the bubble of its historical time, because I think it's one of the reasons why we write these books is to draw from them for new situations. And I'm not afraid to do that. When people ask me all the time, do you see connections between current day child refugees and your father? And I'll say yes. In fact, this summer, my son, who's here, was volunteering with Sudanese and Eritrean refugees in Israel, who are basically these illegal, people who are smuggled into refugees, and they have children. And I had this moment when I saw him with these children in the playground in Tel Aviv, and all of a sudden I just kind of thought, my father, I could just see him, even though, of course, it's a very different situation. Children are children, right? I think there are a lot of insights in the book about that, including, because I researched a lot in the archives of aid organizations who help these refugees, and so there was a lot of thinking about how do you help refugee children, and what do you do, and how do you school them, and who will school them, and so on. So I don't think, it was important to me to place it specifically, but I think the story can be read as other, and people do read it. A lot of people who are not related to the story write me and talk to me about it. Even Poles, people who are not nationalists, and they say, oh, I actually learned what happened to my Christian Polish relative also.
First of all, Mikhal, thank you for a very complex and instructive lecture. Like your book, it's many layered and there are many centers to it. One of those centers, which the discussion hasn't returned to, the gulags. And I wanted to ask, the Fortunov archives were created so that there would be video testimony of survivors before they'd all died. The survivors of the Gulag, there can't be many left now, and I'm wondering, as far as you know, is there a comparable video archive project being undertaken? Obviously not in Russia.
There really isn't. There are some videos. I mean, one of the best sources that we have is that in 1943, basically the Polish government in exile had people in all of these places that refugees arrived, especially in Palestine, who were interviewing and in some cases videotaping people who gave testimonies in 1943, 1944. I have my father's testimony. It's one of the most amazing sources that I have. So we have those, and these are very important also because they're really early on. I don't know that there's stuff that was done later, unfortunately. But there's still a lot. I mean, there's a lot. I'm really hoping that other scholars take this on because there's a lot of material, especially in Israel, in all kinds of smaller archives that people write their experiences, not so much videos.
Oh, as always, a great lecture. I was intrigued. I want to ask just a very quick question about slow history. Okay,
About?
doing history slowly. I just wonder, it's kind of fast forwarding a few decades. How does that concept fit in with the fact that information, if not disinformation, societal change, environmental, it's all happening with increased rapidity, if not exponentially increasing, if I could use a technical term. But how does that concept fit in with the fact that everything is accelerating quickly? How does history keep pace with this, in your view?
So I was waiting, when I was writing about slow memory, I was thinking, I'm not going to write it because, of course somebody will say, look, but there's revisionism every day on Twitter, and I mean, I don't know how it fits in. I just know that I think very strongly that it's the role of scholars to seek the truth and take time to do that. How they get that to the general public. I mean, I know that there are also people who are work on the internet and are mavericks and are fighting falsification and so on. People do that, but I don't see that as our role. And I think also memory studies has become a field in the last decade. And one of the nice things about it is it's completely international. So there are people working from every country, and I think that it has to be collaborative. It has to be transnational and collaborative and so on. So, I mean, I don't know, I guess we have to do both. We have to do responsible historical research that takes time and to think about these issues, and we have to fight misinformation in the present, which of course is happening every day.
I want to call on Jana Joseph, who is the Director of Administration in the English Department. Jana. And I'm going to just announce that we've reached the end of our program. I want to thank Mikhal for a very thought-provoking lecture this evening, and all of you for attending. And for those of you who are here in person, Professor Dekel will be signing complimentary copies of her book, Tehran Children, at the back of the hall. Thank you.